Assalamu alaikum, namaste, good evening. Welcome again to another episode of Globespan 24x7. This program is brought to you live via Facebook and YouTube. Compliments of Mr. Nohar Singh, Devin, and the technical team that operates out of Queens, New York. We're coming to you today in the aftermath of what all of you have been seeing that's being played out on television. I'm referring to the public assassination or murder, if you will, of George Floyd on Monday, May 25th. All of you have seen the video, which lasted for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And that event has sparked a lot of protests, a lot of rallies, and a lot of outcry in the United States and in major metropolitan cities around the world. We condemn the violence, obviously, and we hope that a genuine discussion, discourse, and actions can take place to address the multitude of problems that are coming to fore in American society, whether it's about systemic or institutional racism, privilege, economic inequality, and so on. I think Professor Hilary Beckles, the Vice Chancellor of UE, said it best. What we are seeing is the soul of Black folks have been scarred forever, and the soul of the world has been awakened. There are a number of protests taking place, I'm sure, in your neighborhoods where you live. Just for the in terms of passing on this information to our viewers, just be aware that there is one that is being planned by the Diaspora Council. So let me just share this with you very quickly. The Diaspora Council is holding a peace vigil for George Floyd tomorrow in Queens. And this will be located near Sybil's restaurant, the famous Sybil's restaurant. And the gathering will start at 11 a.m. tomorrow. For those of you who are interested in being part of this rally, please contact Vishnu Mahadeo. His number is 347-484-0565. And I will provide that information with our viewers again later.
Sybil's and Liberty Avenue.
That is exactly Sybil's, okay, which is a famous location. I believe it was the first restaurant that was established in that area by a Guyanese, right? So people know where Sybil's is, and that's in Richmond Hill.
There's one in Brooklyn too, you know.
There is one in Brooklyn, but this one is in Queens, Richmond Hill. All right. And again, I will provide that information. It's organized by the Diaspora Council. And you can contact Vishnu Mahadev. I believe Globespan will also be, carrying the event, which obviously is being held tomorrow. So, gentlemen, this brings us to our focus on the state of affairs at home in Guyana. There's no question in my mind, at least in the mind of this moderator, that we are and we still remain a divided nation. If you don't believe me, take a look at the posturings from both sides, whether it's a coalition or the opposition. Obviously, the election and the recount is a primary focus. I know all of you are reading about that. There's tons of information out there. But we do see the back and forth among different people when you look at social media that sometimes this brings out the worst in our Guyanese community. For instance, if you look at even this show, you look at the comments that are being made, you will see comments being made about people of African descent from Guyana, where people use terms like hungry bellies, Africans are very violent, and of course you've got from the other side, you would see comments like Indians are drug dealers, and of course that famous one, the only good coolie is the dead coolie. So the division is there, it exists, and that's a concern because it's not something that automatically appeared after the 2020 elections. So we will continue with our discussion, and perhaps it is probably, if I can put this in a framework, maybe what Dominic Gaskin, the former AFC Minister of Business, said makes a lot of sense, which is that race voting is not necessarily racism, neither is the passionate advocacy for better conditions for a particular ethnicity. However, a lot of our recent behavior has crossed the line and is clearly racist and harmful to social cohesion. Again, that's Dominic Gaskin. So we are united. We are united as Guyanese, but the term being Guyanese is a legal term, right? We're citizens of a specific country. But we have two regular guests here tonight who are our resident in-house guests, namely Mr. Dev and Dr. Hinds. They are very familiar faces. Mr. Dev is considered to be an Indian rights activist, David Hinds, and please correct me if I overstep here. Dr. Hinds has on many occasions said that he speaks for Africans. Right. So our theme for tonight, continuing with our past discussion, is a nation divided and how can we fix it together? Emphasis being on together. So before I get to our chief guest, I'd like our two regular guests to make an opening comment. First, I'll go to David and then Dev.
Yeah. Good night to your viewers and to my co-panelists. I've never said I speak for Africans, Guyanese. I've never been elected by African Guyanese, and I would not be presumptuous to say I speak for them. I defend African Guyanese when I think they're under attack, as I do when I think Indian Guyanese have been under attack. I've defended them. I'm a Guyanese of African descent, but my concern and my activism has been across race. I want to use my opening comment to draw attention to what is happening in America today. And there is a lot that can be said. Professor Hilary Beckles says it best. But I would like to draw one lesson for us Guyanese that we can draw from what's happening in the streets of America. And that is when you deny reality, it comes back to haunt you. In America, America's been denying that it has a racial problem. It has proclaimed the end of race after the end of the civil rights movement. And then again, when President Obama was elected, we heard about the end of race. Well, can anyone tell me when what you're seeing, first of all, what you saw happening to George Floyd and the aftermath of that, whether race has come to an end? And the lesson for us in Guyana is that we are also into that nonsense of denying that we have a race problem. And often it takes extreme developments that we see, like we're seeing in America, for us to realize that we are living a lie. And so, as I said, I think the biggest lesson for us Guyanese is for us to take a deep look at ourselves and our society and confront the reality that we have endemic ethnic problems in Guyana that many times manifest themselves as race and racism. We're not historical enemies in Guyana, but we behave as historical enemies. And so often our ethnic differences take on a racial outlook. And I think even as we are steeped in the moment of elections in Guyana, it is not too late for us to admit that what is all over what is happening in Guyana is the ethnic problem that manifests itself as race.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Dev?
Well, for myself, after 20 years in America, being a student and then establishing myself in America, I returned to Guyana around 1988-89. And it was a crucial time in Guyana's history where the Iron Curtain had fallen and Guyana was transitioning towards free and fair elections. And an interesting development occurred which raised my consciousness, so to speak, where the PPP, which had been rigged out of office for over 24 years, the leader of the PPP, groups in the society were saying that Dr. Jagan could not become the leader of the united groups that was going to take on the PNC because he was an Indian. I found that rather interesting for it to be formulated. And then it was clearly stated that if Dr. Jagan were to lead the opposition at that point, there would be a rebellion by the army and it'll be overthrown. In fact, Jagan then proposed, why not Dr. Luncheon? And of course, the objection to Dr. Luncheon in a famous formulation was, he's black, but he's too red. Be as it may, from that point on, I began to look a bit strongly at what Guyana was. And we found through yourself, Dr. Betoram, through structured interviews, that the WPA's claim at that point to have bridged the racial divide was in fact not so, that the racial divides were still there, still entrenched. And when in 1998, you had the breakout of violence in Georgetown, when Indians were beaten, that confirmed the surveys that had been done, that you did have a race problem with Guyana, and that manifested itself with anti-Indian violence by African Guyanese, whether organized by their political leaders or not, but that threat of violence is always there. So here in 2020, what I am hearing from Dr. Hinds and from other individuals from the Black community, that, and I'm being very blunt about this, that if this election ends with a PPP's victory, then there'll be all hell breaking out in the streets of Georgetown and maybe further afield. And therefore, I believe we have to talk about this, address it, and see what we can do going forward. Hence my participation in these discourses.
All right, thank you. So I'd like to introduce our chief guest tonight. You all know him as Mr. Christopher Ram. He is an accountant, but I believe he's officially called chartered. I'm not sure what chartered means, but it sounds like he's a very powerful accountant in Guyana. He's also an attorney to profession. He does write a column in Stabrick News, and he has been writing a lot lately on the oil economy. He's known as an anti-corruption crusader. I don't know if you will accept that definition, but he has been speaking out against corruption. He has spoken out against racism in the past and so on. He actually also has a show which is called Plain Talk. So he's a talk show host, but today he is in the hot seat. You may also remember that Mr. Christopher Ram was recommended to be a GCOM chairperson. And of course, it was Mr. Patterson who occupied that position. So Chris, if I can call you Chris, with all due respect, are these two boys wrong? Is Guyana a racially divided nation?
You know, thank you very much for having me, Dr. Betoram. We have two major races, but we don't only have two major races. And it bothers me that all discussions on Guyana always seem to have this bifurcation, the Indians on the one side and the blacks or the Afro-Guyanese on the other. I think we have problems that are even greater. We have an economy that is controlled by non-Guyanese. We don't pay any attention to that. We bother about some of the crumbs, our bauxite, our rice, rice largely Guyanese, our bauxite, our gold, our petroleum, our forestry. Even in the communities, David would tell you, Ravi would tell you, you have, despite having the Investment Act, which specifically states who can invest what where, we just have a free-for-all. And whilst we are fighting over this ethnic space and this political space, the rug of our wealth is taken away from us, and then we are condemned to the kind of poverty cycle, even with the blessings of oil. And you have there's views about blessing and curse. And when you read about what's happening with the flaring, you wonder, did we think this thing through carefully? That's going away. That's shipping out of our hands. We don't even know what's happening. We have EITI in this country, and there's a delay. We can't even see the sales contracts for the petroleum being sold. So I think as a country, we have spent far too much time on the negatives, on the things that keep us apart. Because I agree with Dominic Gaskin. The fact that sugar workers, going all the way back to 1948, may have supported the PPP, or the bauxite workers, the PNC, that doesn't make those people racial. They vote based on their interests. If their interest happens to coincide with race, are we going to say, oh, this is all about race? So, and I have to say, I don't consider myself part of that debate, part of that community, tribal, ethnic, whatever you want to call it. I'm a democratic Guyanese nationalist. My country comes first, regardless of who is or who are not in power. The interest of Guyanese as a whole. And I really would like to see us getting back to thinking about what it is we want for our country. What is holding back our growth? If you think how old our country is, the first sugar estates, the first rice field, and where are we? Some of you, David Hinds, Ravi, Dr. Bester Ram, you've all done very well. But think of the number of people who have been left behind, generations and generations, because we have lost sight of what is important to us. That's my opening contribution, sir.
Well, David, it is Chris being a little simplistic, because you said, and you made it a point, that there is a racial division. So, I mean, what's wrong with how he sees Guyana?
Well, nothing is wrong with what Chris has said. I share everything that Chris has said. Where I depart from Chris is not one or the other. We've got to do both. We've got to think about Guyana, but we've got to also think about what history has left us. Let me just before I go on, just a little clarification for Ravi. Ravi, I am not saying if the PPP wins, there will be violence by Africans. I am saying that neither of the two communities will accept the victory of the other. I think Indian Guyanese have showed their hand as far as violence is concerned on March 6th. Africans have not been on the street. Indians have shown their hands. So it is possible that if the PPP were to lose, you will see a repeat or an elaboration of what is March 6th. We have to be very careful that we don't put the violent tag on Africans alone. Both societies, both communities, I think, are in a mood to defend what they think is a victory and to act on their fears and their thing. I just want to say that. Getting back to Chris, as I said, I think Chris is everything he says is correct, but it is not one or the other. How do you look at African people who have a unique history? They are the only people in that country who were brought against their will in chains, enslaved for 200 and odd years, are up to date. Look at America. The scars of bondage are fresh, and you are telling them that they spend too much time talking about race? No, we have to be more sensitive than that, all right? Indian people have their own history, their own narrative of suffering. You can't look at them and tell them they spend too much time on race. I think we have to be very careful about not understanding how these things are interrelated. That Guyana is not going to move forward. That the development that Mr. Ram talks about is only going to be possible once we come to a consensus. And that consensus has to be realized on quieting the fears and the insecurities of the ethnic groups. Let me just say one other thing, and I'll shut up. Nobody's shutting out the other ethnic groups from the discourse in Guyana, but those ethnic groups have not fought each other. There was no ethnic disturbance between Amerindians and blacks. I mean, they've had their problems, but they did not escalate to what Indians and Africans saw in the 1960s and even in the 1990s and the early 2000s. So it is not about an exclusion of the other ethnicities. It's about an acknowledgement that the flashpoint, the ethnic flashpoint, it is between Africans and Indians.
Mr. Dev, you have written a lot, tremendously, about something called the ethnic security dilemma. Is it a fact that that Indians don't seem to understand the security concern for Africans, or Africans don't understand the security concern for Indians? How do you see it?
Well, you see, the thing is, that when you talk about these dilemmas, they are based on structural conditions that are immanent in the society. It's not due to only an individual feeling a certain way. And that's part of the problem. A societal structure is one where it almost leads you to behave in a certain fashion. And so when I returned to Guyana, looking at things, what I detect is what George Lamming had spoken about, and in his epigraph for Walter Rodney's history of the Guyanese working class. He says it, that in the Caribbean, there's a stubborn refusal by the black middle class to accept Indian striving for progress as a strategy for conquest, and therefore it is resisted. And I go back to how people will react to the leadership of African Guyanese. So when Mr. Burnham and Dr. Jagan went to the Ghana independence celebrations in 1957, Dr. Jagan, it is recorded in the books there, had requested a meeting because there were several West Indian leaders there to talk about, the two groups coming together. Forbes Burnham by then was out of the PPP and so on. But the leaders of the Caribbean were brought together by Padmore. Jagan was excluded from that meeting, and they agreed that there was a danger of Jagan forming an Indian state in the Caribbean, which must be resisted. Jagan only found out about this meeting when Dr. Solomon mentioned it when they were returning back to Trinidad. The point is, therefore, what we see in Guyana now, apart from other parts of the Caribbean, is a refusal by African Guyanese leadership to concede that Indo-Guyanese are a part of the Caribbean, that we are Guyanese people, and that we should have an opportunity to also be in the power structures there. So after every elections, after rigging them for 28 years, in 92 you had violence, in 97 you had violence, in 2001 you had violence, then you had African resistance movement segueing all the way to 2008. And I hear of the threats, but because all of the coercive apparatus of the state is in African Guyanese hands, again, all hell will break loose unless it goes one way and unless they are given a seat at the table. Now, all of this has to be addressed. We can't sweep this under the rug. So coming back to Chris's formulation, of course I would want all of that. That is where we are headed, but how do we get from where we are to where we want to be at. And that is what I think this discussion is all about.
So to come back to you, Chris, I know you define yourself as a Guyanese nationalist. So let's take that for a second. And you do reject the ethnic perspective, for lack of better words. How do you think this thing will end? Let's assume it ends on June 16th. We know the Prime Minister of Trinidad says it's not going to end nice. So do you anticipate any kind of problem when that, reconfirmation, assuming it's going to be declared at that time?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's necessarily going to be declared on the 16th. I think there's a misunderstanding of the sequence of the events in the amended order. But the past few moments shows you how easy it is for us to that conversation. And when I talked about the time spent discussing ethnicity and race and tribalism, I spoke of Guyanese. Because I can say, I can't feel what David Hinds feels. As a Guyanese of Afro descent, resident in America, I, as an Indian, and vice versa. What we can do is we can feel the pain of Guyanese suffering at the hand of an economic system of which we are victims. But let's move on. And this comparison with America and Guyana, I think they're vastly different as well. There are similarities. It's easy to play some of these things. America with the rednecks, the white supremacists, the KKK, and these are official bodies. That can't happen, and we should be proud of our country, of what we have in common. Religion, culture, and all of those things. We really have things to be proud about, but we love to emphasize the differences. Now, how is it going to end? Look, 93 days ago, I voted. My vote is still not being counted. That's one of the most fundamental things to democracy. I am a Democrat. I use the word Democrat. And I've got this Constitution of Guyana, Article 1, secular, indivisible, and democratic. We have had, over the past, 18 months or more now, an abrogation of key sections of our Constitution. We do not have a parliament in this country. It's having been dissolved since December 31, 2019. We have, and I'd love to invite David's comments on this, Article 2193 talks about what kind of spending should be taking place. At this time, when there is no parliament, there is a dissolved parliament, there's no budget. 2193 says you can only spend money on government services. We have key members of the government functioning in their political roles. That cannot be defended on no ethnic discussion comes into play in that type of arrangement. That is completely lawlessness. You asked how are things going to happen. David said, well, who is going to win? I think, and David did talk about we must not deny reality. Well, one of the realities was Claremont Mingo engaged in one of the most blatant frauds you could probably imagine anywhere. You had your statements of polls, you then put them on a spreadsheet. I have a spreadsheet around me. That's all that was necessary. But you had these imaginary numbers. Now, democracy doesn't have a race. It doesn't have a tribe. It doesn't have a culture. Democracy has it. And if we want to move ahead as a country, we have to have common standards. The recount that is taking place at this great cost is turning out to be a farce. You have the commissioner of police telling the chairperson of GCOM, who wrote him without authority of GCOM, that persons were out of the country And if the chairperson of GCOM had simply asked the chief elections officer or one of the persons in the GCOM, was this person truly out of the country? They would have found that Devendra Kissoon, for example, was an accredited observer at the election. It makes a complete farce about everything that is taking place with these elections. What the recount is proving that Mingo was fraudulent. The statements of recounts and the statements of polls are almost identical, except for votes here and where reject votes might have been, where a vote might have been rejected, but on reflection, they've accepted it. We're talking about reality. You have the gentleman from the United States saying 8,000 votes for soldiers have been disenfranchised. Look, we have less than 200 votes that were not stamped, and there is no way that under our paper-based system that anyone, let alone someone sitting in the United States of America, could say 8,000 votes. That's the kind of reality as we talk, Ravi, David, and I and you, Dr. Betaram, we have to accept certain given things. We have to decide, are we a country of a rule of law? Are we accepting the Constitution? Are we going to accept the reality? We may not like how voting, but I have said, and I've written, Guyana should be proud that in 5 years, the voters changed governments twice. That's unprecedented. For 51 years, we had changed, well, once and twice. We should be proud about that. But we love to emphasize our differences. We talk about and David, I can tell you, I was upset about that incident in Region 5. But I don't think we should somehow put that at the feet of all Indians. There were lots of Indians who were totally upset at the person who committed electoral violence. And thank goodness it did not continue. And we must welcome these things. We must emphasize and exaggerate some of these problems, because we then lose sight of the bigger challenges which our society faces: economic, social, political, and I'm sure we're going to find some time to talk about power sharing, because the other day David wrote a piece on the advantages of power sharing, and I was really looking forward to see a follow-up the disadvantages. I didn't see it. David, I hope you're still going to do that.
Well, Chris, as a person who was, studied Guyanese society, I want to speak to you as a Guyanese. Everything you just said, it seems to me that, there's going to be some trouble when this thing is done. And I'm not sure, what advice you would have for all Guyanese, because I don't see those who control power willing to share it. And I don't see the other side, the opposition, giving in to anything, because in their view, everything is fraudulent, and a lot of that information is coming out. So I'm still very apprehensive as to how this thing is going to end. And of course, Prime Minister Rowley's comment is always there on the top of my head, because we have a history in Guyana. And that history has shown that there's always going to be some level of violence. And that's my fear about what we're seeing playing out in Guyana.
And the question?
The question is, what advice would you offer to make me feel comfortable that this thing is going to end nicely?
Well, I am concerned that there is a fear inside Guyana, and indeed outside of Guyana, that there will be serious post-declaration now violence in Guyana. That's the reality. You see, we've gone so far. On March the 5th, one party declared, look, I'm going to be president again for another 5 years. And we have fed that narrative. I heard today, I don't want to get involved in this side and that side, but let's deal with what is factual. Let's deal with whether or not we are saying that if these, and when I say we, I mean leaders like Ravi, David, Harmon, Jagdio, Ifanali, are they prepared to accept the constitutional framework and to recognize that, look, there are problems, we have to fix those problems. Constitutional arrangement is a continuous exercise. It's always a work in progress. And we know about the Harmanston Accord. We know about the significant provisions made which are still unimplemented. And I'm hoping we can get around that. So I'm not going to say much more. I would like to point out where we do have power sharing, significant power sharing, but we're missing important elements. And if we can fix those important, and they're not too difficult elements, we may bring about a general solution. And I know that it's going to still have a problem. I don't want to oversimplify, but we have to start incrementally at reaching solutions to what we consider endemic problems.
So, okay, so let's talk about, going forward now, right? After this election and all this impasse is over. And you mentioned, David had mentioned or written about power sharing. So for the sake of discussion, I'd like to ask David, what are some things, can you give us some tangible things that you would see or you would like to see in what we call as power sharing arrangement?
No, I am not into tangible things on this program. I am prepared to go on a program on power sharing to talk about those tangible things. I don't think those tangible things are going to end the discussion here. I think what we have to talk about is the spirit of power sharing, which I'm prepared to talk about. But let me just say two things before I press on. First, that democracy doesn't have a race. Well, democracy doesn't have a race where people in a particular country are of the same race. Democracy does have a race in racially divided societies. That is, the different ethnic groups have a different notion of democracy, right? I just want to let him. We always have to remember that when we take race neutral formulations and try to impose them on racially divided societies, we are creating a bigger problem. The next thing I want to say is Chris also said that you look to America. Again, I have to be the one here to speak about the African condition. There's such a thing as Pan-Africanism. Whether you're Black in America, as Peter Tosh said, or you're from Trinidad, or you're from Guyana, or you're from Minneapolis, so long as you're a Black man, you're an African, the artist Peter Tosh, there is solidarity, always solidarity between Black people wherever they are. Because what has happened to George Floyd happens to us every day. And often other ethnic groups don't quite and that's one of our problems in Guyana. We don't spend time understanding the condition of the other ethnic groups. You know, Walter Rodney, just before he died, recognized that problem and started a series of books for children, Latch Me Out of India, Kofi Out of Africa, to deal with that problem. As African, as Black people, there is a peculiarity, I have to stress that here tonight, of our condition. And you can throw democracy at us when somebody has their knee on our necks in the name of democracy. The state, that knee on George Floyd's neck was the knee of the state, a democratic state.
Can I ask you this?
One has to be very, very careful.
Okay, good.
Let me finish. I always have to beg to finish, and I don't know why.
That's not ethnic. Let's go.
I always have to beg to finish, and I don't know why.
Chris, let him finish, and then we'll get to you. Thank you.
Okay,
ahead, David.
That was a democratic knee on that man's neck. And we face that wherever we are. And I cannot be on a program where it's being trifled. When Africans behave badly, as they did in 1998, we didn't say, oh, it wasn't all Africans. We condemned it. And what happened on March 2nd, the Indian community must take responsibility for it. And it must not be dismissed. And what I hear here is a dismissal of it, which is, so Indians are not inherently violent. It was just a little thing. But Africans are inherently violent. When they do it, it's a big thing. Now, those kinds of things, those kinds of formulations are what has gotten us to this point, where we talk willy-nilly about democracy and who's a Democrat and who's not a Democrat. For all those people, 40% of them who, or 50, I don't know, who voted for the coalition, so they are not Democrats. They're something else. And then we have to be very, very careful. We have a crisis of democracy in Guyana. We don't have democracy in Guyana. We have a crisis of democracy in Guyana. And that crisis of democracy has at its core an unwillingness for us to agree to live as a society where we accept each other as equals, as co-equals in a society, as Walter Rodney called, as joint, what he called as joint communities in a country. And we have to address the question of ethnic equity before we talk about democracy. We can't have democracy when we don't have ethnic equity. And this election is also about ethnic equity. And those are things that we are dismissing by talking about these universal concepts and not concretizing them in our local circumstances.
I want to come back to that question of ethnic equity, but before I get to Mr. Dev, Chris, you want to give a response?
No, let Ravi go on. Let Ravi go.
All right. So, Mr. Dev, you want to give a response to what?
Well, I come back again. David talks about sticking to the reality, and we got to stick to the reality. And he hasn't addressed or refuses to address something I've been making from the very beginning. I mean, when I returned to Guyana, I came up with this formulation of the ethnic security dilemmas, where I said that if Indian Guyanese, who were the majority, vote as a bloc, African Guyanese are going to be excluded from the executive, and that creates a dilemma for them to go along with majoritarian democracy. I presented that. But since then, the arrow of time has moved on. And we have a situation now where Guyana is a nation of minorities. We now have Indians below 39, probably 35%. We have Africans around 30%. We have the mixed population, which is 20% in building, and Amerindians are 10%. So it means what we saw in 2015. We were able to have what I call regular elections. I had lobbied for that. I had written for that. As if the PNC were to come off this big and bad and bullying approach, they could get back into governance through regular politics, because the PPP has its own contradictions which were manifesting themselves. And lo and behold, as the prophets say, they got back into government in coalition with the AFC. It is their fault that they shot themselves in the foot. So I come back to the point that at this election again, The PPP cannot win just with Indian votes. They have to reach across the divide. So I believe we are at the point where we have to. It's like a poll. It's like the poll you did in 1990. 97, where you show that the WPA's contention that the Africans were going to vote for WPA was severe. They were going to vote for the PNC. We are at a point where this election can show where the Guyanese people are at ethnically. And what I think, to my great delight, is that both sides are able to get some votes from the other sides. So if the PNC were to win this election, it would mean like the last time they got votes from outside their core constituency. And if the PPP were to win, they would have gotten votes from across the core constituency. So I'm saying we at long last are like a situation like in Trinidad, where you have the politics of in and out, and we have to give it a chance. We have to give it a chance. So I don't think there's something intrinsic for David to say, well, that we can't, you can't have the PPP get in back there. You know they will do this or do that. Indian Guyanese accepted the PNC in power because it was the PNC. The WPA was given short shrift after 2015. AFC was given even shorter shrift. Everybody was given shorter shrift. It was the PNC in action. And they went along with that. You understand? So I think at this juncture, we have an opportunity to get back to regular politics and let it begin. Let us try it for a while. Let us see what happens.
I disagree with Ravi Betaram. He said I haven't addressed it. He said, and he's correct, because he has been making that point repeatedly. And I haven't addressed it because I disagree with it. Ravi is saying that it is the end of the ethnic dilemma. It is not, from my standpoint. It is not. Elections are not going to bring an end to the ethnic dilemma. In fact, the opposite, I think, is correct, is that the election results, whether you change government every 5 years, it exacerbates the ethnic security dilemma. It doesn't end it. What you do is you change government, but the fundamental problems there in the society among the people continues. And so therefore, I disagree with Ravi. This formalist change of government, what I call exchange, is really going to solve the dilemmas. It is not going to solve the dilemmas. The coalition was in power for 5 years, and after 5 years, I don't think the ethnic dilemma has gotten better. It has gotten worse, if you ask me. And if we follow that trajectory, if the PPP comes to power and it's here for the next 5 years, I don't see the ethnic dilemma being ended because Indian Guyanese, they didn't come on the streets in 2015, but they undermined the government from 2015 on. And even if people don't come on the streets at the end of this recount and the PPP wins, African Guyanese will undermine the PPP. So I don't see how the ethnic security dilemma is solved, Ravi.
So, Chris, I know you had to make a comment earlier. So you want to jump in?
Well, I wanted Ravi to go. And David, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you would take that as some kind of ethnic, whatever you might call it. Now you talk about a democratic need is placed on persons. Are we? And I do have this problem. Are you speaking of the U.S. or are you speaking of Guyana? You talk about the power and happens to us everywhere. Are we talking about Guyana or are we talking about the U.S.?
Universally, Guyana and the United States. African people, given the history, given our history, wherever we find ourselves, even when they are black governments, even when we are black governments, the structure and the development of the society, as inherent in it, anti-black prejudices, anti-black prejudices in economics, anti-black anti-black prejudice in politics, anti-black prejudice in culture.
Chris, you want to?
And it doesn't matter whether it's in Guyana or America, whether there is a black leader in Guyana or not. None of the black leadership in the Caribbean has solved the problem of structural racism against African people, black people.
Even in the countries in which they have 95%.
Yes, yes, yes.
Now, David is raising this concept of ethnic equity. You know, for all of us who did a little law, equity, what was the saying, is the length of the chancellor's foot. We using these terms, David does not want to discuss in any tangible sense the question of power sharing, which is he and his party. And they've always, I thought I saw a very extensive letter, I believe it's by AUC Guyana, about power sharing. But, you know, it's okay to throw these terms out there. Quite what do they mean? And how do we concretize them? How do we incorporate them in whatever governance structure, instrument, constitution, whatever? How do we do it? And we have to reduce these concepts to very practical, operational methods so that everyone knows the rules that we're playing by. If we want to abrogate the Constitution, let us say that. Let us say, because of the ethnic division of our country, democracy means nothing. Let's say that. Don't let us go to elections. And when you feel, and I don't believe, you see, one of the things I really believe, and David knows this because David and I have had endless discussions, including about power sharing and its government. We don't have in political parties. They are the most unregulated entities in our country. They are subject to no rules, no accountability, no transparency, anything. The first thing we've got to decide, are we going to play by any set of rules? What are those rules? And how do we make them acceptable to a wide cross-section of our population? Everybody is not going to accept it, which is why I am a little bit disturbed when David said just some Indians must take responsibility. You said March the 2nd, David. I don't think you meant
March the 6th. My bad.
Why the whole country has to take responsibility? Are you labeling all of us as this violent set of people? As I said, David, I was very upset. I could not understand which idiot, and Dr. Baker Ram, you know, I tend to use strong language. Why would they go after a bus? I mean, it is so stupid. But now to throw that back at an entire, Ravi Dev says 39% of the population. Well, even if it was 1%, I thought it would have been unfair. We need to stop just demonizing any group, even whether we feel we're victims or victors. We must stop that. It's not getting us anywhere. Because I've gone through discussion with David. David has been one of my regular guests on Play Talk. This is not getting us anywhere. How do we do it? That's what we got to decide.
Well, let's see if we can move it along from here. David, you're placing your bets on what you term ethnic equity. Can you share with us what does that mean from your perspective?
Well, what it means is that we have to face the economic standing of the various groups. And we have to be very careful when we're doing that. Because wealth is not shared within groups. So what you find is what we call Indian wealth is concentrated at the top among the Indian elites. And the Indian masses are as poor as the black masses. But you don't say that to a black person who believes that Indians have more wealth than black people. They don't make the distinction across lines. And Indian people, including Indian working people, subscribe to the stereotype that black people have no interest in wealth. Even if you give them, give them all that they need in order to create wealth. They have no interest in that. All right. So the conversation has always been skewed about the distribution of wealth in Guyana. So Africans, for example, the African elite is left out of the commercial sector because that's where the wealth is generated. The Portuguese, the Indian elites, the Chinese at that level. So we've got to deal with distribution of wealth at that level. The question of contracts, for example. Most of the contracts go to non-African elites, economic elites. And so therefore, there's no trickle down going on within the African Guyanese community. So we've got to correct that disparity. No, that disparity didn't start yesterday. It didn't start under the PPP. It didn't start under the PNC. It goes right back to the post-emancipation era, where direct policies by the colonial authority were meant to marginalize Africans from the formal economy. And that has traveled with us to where we are today. So we've got to look at the issue of equitable distribution of wealth. There are models across the world that we can look at. But one thing, as I said, we have to be very careful about, and that is to believe that Indian workers are richer than African Guyanese workers. I think that's a myth, but that's what happens in ethnic societies, especially by the group that feels that it is structurally disenfranchised.
Mr. Dev, my understanding, based on my own family's experience, is that wealth was accumulated over time. It has to do with hard work and a work ethic. So families become enriched by that process, which is a natural process to do it. And I know that according to Clive Thomas, 80% of the economy was once controlled by the Barnum regime. So what is the problem here? Why couldn't blacks achieve equity when we talk about things?
They don't work hard. You just said that they don't work hard.
Well, let me address the political question. I'll get to the economic one because they are interrelated. The political question, again, I go back to this new Guyana, that we must not just talk theory. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have a similar situation where after 36 years of the PNM, the politics, because of the change of demographics, you have the politics of in and out. So while they have a similar structure like ours, in fact, identical in terms of the ethnic groups, you have a less strident politics where Rowley can go in or Kamala can come in without the sky falling down. And what has happened is that they played a moderating politics, because once the PNM realized that it does not have an inbuilt majority like Eric had at one time, it had to moderate its programs and its policies. And so, for example, I have spent as much time in Trinidad as I have in Guyana politics. And so over there, I have like people I knew, Satmaraj from the Mahasabha. He was more friendly with the PNM because he was able to get more benefits out of the PNM than Basdev Pandey would ever give him. And he showed it in his thing. So to come back to Guyana, I know it is something new, but we have to give it a chance that we have this new situation where the PNC can only blame itself for shooting itself in the foot for taking those steps that it did. And it has been voted out. And I think the PPP, if it is stupid enough not to take into cognizance the concerns of African Guyanese when it formulates its programs, then it will be voted out. Because I think Guyanese in general want a peaceful Guyana. So that's a political question. And we have proposed something called an ethnic impact statement. We're ahead of time. If the PPP is going to start spending in a certain area, you should at least have an idea of its ethnic impact, because that's how the post-mortem will be done, ethnic impact. So to move on to the economic one now, and this is where David is talking about equity. Yes, I think this is a discussion that must be had in this country. And I've said it again and again, that no one on planet Earth can know what it is to be a black man. And I'm using the term because I think we all, know where we're coming from. But the point is, it goes very deep. It does exist in Guyana. The problem is, I don't want to get too theoretical, but to be white is to be the antithesis of what it is to be black. And it is whites who have formulated that the moment that, what's his name, the Spanish priest, De la Casa, said that Africans have no soul. And the British built upon that. They're the children of Ham who committed sin, therefore we should keep them in sin. So the whole Western edifice is built on putting black people in a particular place. And every group has imbibed that. Whether it is Korean, you have a black man going to Korea, he'll be treated racially. You have a black man go to Russia, he'll be treated in a certain way. So what I'm saying, David, is that it's a universal problem. And I am shocked that I've never failed to be shocked. I have two kids who went to Queen's College. Modern ones, I'm talking within the last 10 years. Graduated, my daughter topped it, head prefect at Queen's, and whatever. The point I'm making, they were not even exposed to old boy Walter Rodney's book, Grounding, with my brothers. They don't understand these concepts. So I am blaming, and I'll be blunt with you, David, I blame the black governments that Walter criticized after the briefcase revolution. Ignore the dilemma of the black man. And we have to call a spade a spade. So I am not saying that this is not, excusing black people as you're hearing about it. We can, but we have to be blunt about what it is. And that's why I have used the term ethnicity rather than race. Race got nothing to do with it. It has to do with your culture and all that. And these are things, David, that we have to talk frankly about. I'll end on this note. I had a very frank discussion, or many frank discussions with Mr. Hoyt while I was in Parliament, many discussions for days, some lasted nights. And the point that Mr. Hoyt wrote, he wrote a paper which every black should go back to in 1988, the 150th anniversary of the end of slavery. And he calls it Beyond the Horizon, where he says that because of slavery, African Guyanese, or African on the whole, do not look forward. It's not a criticism, because after slavery, when Orlando Patterson, we quoted, said blacks suffered social death, there was nothing for you to look forward to. But David, this is something that Africans have to look. Nobody's going to do it. I want to be blunt with it. Something, I'll end again with this, that Swami and I came out and came back to the country in the 80s. And when we saw that Hindu children were not given the respect, my daughter at Queen's had to cut off her raksha. At Queen's, that's a Hindu pagan thing. Swami, what he did, he formed a school. And he said, I'm going to give Queen's College a run for his money. And he's doing that at SVN. So to end it all, we have to confront the black social dilemma. And nobody can get away with that, or pretend it's an excuse. But I think it's a different discourse, and it must not just be piggybacked onto the political one. It's related there. But black governments also have to bear responsibility for that. And I'll end here for now.
We're coming up against a hard break, so I want to give Chris a chance to respond to anything that both of you said. I know he's sitting there patiently, and then we'll go to a break.
Well, your question was about ethnic equity, and it seems that right. David has emphasized the economic standing of various groups. Now, I don't think it would be true to say that Indians are wealthy or not wealthy because of, or in spite of, and at the expense of blacks. I think that would be wrong. I think this whole idea, and we're supposed to be a literate, educated society. We had the situation, Guy Bank, Globe Trust, GNCB, there were lots of efforts. And David, we all belong almost to the same age group. We have not done the kind of serious studies. And I come back to this question. We sometimes focus on the wrong things. We need to consider, how do you lift any segment? Because again, we keep talking about Indians and blacks as though they alone live in this country. And I think that it's time that we stop that nonsense. What about the Amerindians? They can't walk into a commercial bank and given their style of doing business. Are you going to say there's systemic racism against the Amerindians? We have to work out our strengths, our limitations, how we can get around the issues. Because look, you go and I'm going to be accused of being oversimplistic. You do a good business plan. You go to the banks don't care about. I don't think they care about the ethnicity. They care. Do you have a good business plan? I don't think GNCB cared about the ethnicity of the people. So
Yeah.
we talk. Okay, David. No, by the way, I don't mind being interrupted. I think it helps a healthy discussion.
African people can tell their stories, and that narrative that you were saying is untrue.
All right.
It's untrue. And it's one of the reasons that Africans lag behind. It's not because Beto that they don't work hard. They work very, very hard. In fact, they work more hard than some other sectors. They have to work hard.
Come on. Now, if you were to look at
They build their country.
Is the largest
all the canals.
The largest single
creating that
look
place.
At where those resources go.
And they don't work hard.
We need a good discussion where we don't talk past each other, as David said in his column, but we talk to each other. And we need to work out these problems that were there 300-400 years ago are not going to be resolved by shouting at each other, are not going to be resolved by just using labels and then applying different yardsticks for one label. We have to sit down and deal with these economic and social problems, and I think it's possible. I don't think that effort has really been made.
Yeah, and just for the record here, I don't think we're shouting down each other as if we're cussing down. I think we're having a good debate. So let me just say, for those of you who are joining us right now, as a reminder, we're continuing our focus on a nation divided. Our focus tonight is how do we fix the problem, but obviously we can't ignore that historical element to this. I just want to remind our audience that tomorrow the Diaspora Council is hosting a peace vigil for George Floyd tomorrow in Queens. This is in Richmond Hill, next to Sybil's restaurant, and that that vigil will start at 11 a.m. Please contact Mr. Vishnu Mahadeo at 347-484-0565, and hopefully we'll see all of you there tomorrow. So at this point, gentlemen, we have to pay the bills. So the producer is texting me that we have to go to a quick break. So over to you, Devin.
Globespan 24x7 is offering professional streaming services. Be at ease and let Globespan 24x7 handle all of your streaming services for talk shows, religious programs, funerals, and birthdays. Get professional streaming done with ease. Globespan 24x7 professional streaming services will give you the peace of mind that you deserve. Call 631-782-9272. That's 631-782-9272. Or email sales@globespan247.com.
To tell you that the safest way to vote is actually right at home. Go to nycabsentee.com and request a ballot. You complete the ballot, it comes with a stamp, and you send it back. You can still go out and vote on June 23rd, but the safest way to do it is right at home and to do it right now. Thank you.
Gentlemen, welcome again to our discussion here on Globespan. So I want to come back to something that was mentioned before, and I want to pursue this whole notion of ethnic equity. So David seems to be focusing on wealth. If we're pursuing some kind of ethnic equity, is there anything else that you would figure in this formula that has to do with ethnic equity?
No, we're talking about economic equity. That's why wealth is important. And wealth, of course, is all resources, We often say that, Black people earn a lot of money, Indian people earn money, and so on. It's not necessarily wealth. Wealth is something that is developed over a period of time. And as we've said structurally, African Guyanese have never had the opportunities to accumulate wealth. During the early Burnham years, there were some initiatives that were put in place, but those got overrun by the attitude to governance. And I re-emphasize what I said before and what Ravi agreed with, that none of the Caribbean countries, they have solved the problem of African underdevelopment. Because there are anti-Black sentiments even among Black elites. You know, this is not the Indian thing. This is a societal thing that even the Black elites have bought in to some of the notions of Black people, assumptions of Black people. And so that's why when they get the power, they don't deal with the structural problems, you know? And therefore, I know it slipped out. You know, your parents say you work hard, and that's how you think. And you must know that when an African is listening to that, how I feel. Because we have heard that all our lives, all our history, that we don't work hard. And that's why we're poor. And we know differently. And when we hear these things, it signals to us that the whole world is against us. You know, we can't seem to get into this whole notion that Black lives value the same as other ethnic groups, you know? And so we have to be very careful about these things. And it is not to say that the Africans don't use Indian stereotypes. They do. And that's part of our problem, right? Indian Guyanese are going to go tomorrow, and they are going to they are going to show their solidarity with African Americans, but they would not live willingly under a Black government in Guyana. Africans will live under a white. African Guyanese will come and live under white government in America, but will not willingly live under an Indian government in Guyana. Is that not telling us something? I leave that question.
Yeah. All right. So my comment earlier was, I was just expressing my own narrative that wealth, from at least for my family, it was no intended. No intention to say that Africans are not working hard. I was just,
no, I know you don't.
My father, 93 years old, worked in the sugar estate. I saw him build a house, then a much bigger house. He accumulated land and so on. So that's my own narrative, my own experience, right? Hard work is something that's important, and it contributes to wealth. So my question to Mr. Dev, aside from economic equity, if we are going to progress and move forward as a nation, what are some political changes or other kinds of changes do you think we ought to have for us to kind of remain intact as a nation or a community of nations without, or at a minimal state of conflict?
Well, let me just say a few sentences on the economic equity. And I don't normally speak like this, but I think we are here and we are being very open with each other. I think we know each other for decades now, and I can be very frank and share that with our audience also, that I once had one of the conversations with Mr. Hoyt, and he talked about this whole African dilemma. People saw him as aloof and all that, but he told me his dad was a joiner, and he talked about the same thing of working hard and ensuring he became a teacher, and then he did law and what have you. But the point he was making is that the values that are pushed in the African community are not entrepreneurial ones. Coming out of slavery, they saw education as defined by the British. You educate yourselves, you acted properly, you spoke properly, you behaved properly. In a sense, you became more white, and that was seen as progress. And I think enough focus was not placed on economic improvement. And this was a deliberate ploy by the British when they started their schooling. Queen's College never had any practical program for the elite. So when Mr. Burnham, he did the classics, he didn't do anything about engineering or what have you. So Mr. Hoyt's point was that when, for example, he insisted that Barama built his plant not in Region 1 when he brought Barama to Guyana, he had him build the plant on East Bank for Africans to get employment. But he was laughing when he told me, he said, Ravi, on Friday night, you got to see the workers jumping the fence to go party. You understand? It was a cultural problem he talked about. And I'm saying to change these cultural values is not easy, but it has to be done. I was once, 20 years ago, when we were all talking power sharing, I was on with a program with Aubrey Norton. And he said, Ravi, they had a shop. And his dad said, you ain't going to work in this shop, you have to take your education. And so they're steered in a different way. I'm saying we in Guyana have a new opportunity to start from scratch. This oil economy, even though we are getting, as I said before, the husk of the corn, we have a chance to use whatever skills it takes to start afresh and develop ourselves. It's the old economy of working in the fields is gone now. You make billions of dollars through derivatives, just sitting at your desk and betting where the dollar will move. And that's where money is made now, through brain power. So I think it's a new economy, and we can start afresh if we have ethnic impact statements to ensure African Guyanese are given an equal opportunity to go in these areas. So the equity one, on the power one, on political one, just as I think African Guyanese need to be steered into this new economy, into businesses, not taking away from anybody else, but to ensure that they get a fair shake. Similarly, the state in Guyana must be shared equitably. The state that is now controlled by the PNC, totally, it is black dominated. And so black leadership always has that in their mind when they make political decisions. For example, they can do what they're doing with the polls right now because they know they have GCOM under their control, they have the police under their control, the man can give you whatever piece of paper you want, they have the immigration under their control, they have every state institution. So I think if it were to be a bit more balanced, like in Trinidad, you will have a different outcome. And that's one of the equities, in fact, of political equity in participation in the state that we need to get to in any future dispensation.
All right, Chris, I want you to react to a video clip from one of our previous shows. So I'm going to ask Devin, our tech guy, to play that, if you can just take a look at it. Under what conditions would we see a situation like that where you, Eric Phillips, are saying that Guyana should be partitioned?
We don't have a common culture in Guyana. We don't have a nation. We don't have common values. We don't have common goals. We don't have common aspirations. We don't have common perceptions of equality. If that's the case, why do you want to live together? It will always be a struggle.
Chris, is he way out there, or is he making sense, or how do you? Because you're on the ground in Guyana. How do you see that?
Well, I think the person best suited to answer that question is David. I would love to hear David engage Eric Phillips on that situation. But I want to go back to this question of equity. Ravi mentions oil. Now, we know, and David and I have shared lots of time on Plain Talk, how we have given away so much. Now, we had a chance recently for an equitable sharing of what comes to us in the form of a local content policy. Do you know, we got more criticisms from the lots of us. I know I certainly, and lots of other persons, raised a lot of objections about this local content policy. And David, you know who pushed it, and that's so unfortunate. So we are missing every single opportunity because we don't have this broad framework. How do we ensure that the resources of our country, that the patrimony of our country are available to us Guyanese, regardless of what ethnicity. Because I keep saying, we need to talk, we need to stop talking like if it's only Indians and blacks inhabit this land of ours.
Well, let me ask a follow-up question, Chris. We talked about earlier in the show about power sharing and so on. A lot of people talk about constitutional change. I saw Tim Jonas on Facebook saying that we need to have this kind of discussion. So he started a discussion on his Facebook page. And obviously, all of us here on the show would agree with you wholeheartedly that we need to bring the Amerindians into the discussion. And hopefully the Amerindians will be making a lot of noise to be a part of this discussion in the future. But I wanted to ask you, because you're also very political. You write on a regular basis, in the local press. I believe you were part of the WPA. So my question is, aside from constitutional reform, if we're talking about things like power sharing and so on, what are some ingredients, if I can use that term, that you would consider to be part of this power sharing mechanism?
Well, listen, David, he's gone in that direction. I hope you're not going to exclude yourself. Look,
but let me ask you this first. Let's assume theoretically now, no slight on David's part, but I'm just trying to provoke David here. What if the recount shows that the PPP wins? Should the PPP embark on some kind of inclusionary, inclusive power sharing system, or can they make the argument that we are, a country of minority political parties? You guys won in 2015, and maybe APNU may win again in 2025. So would they be justified in extending that olive branch after this long fight?
I don't think they will. They've said very clearly they believe in one-party dominance, and they're going down that road. Right? You can't force these people. Dr. Jagan promised power sharing before he came to power in 1992, and he didn't follow through on it. Mr. Granger promised power sharing, and he came to power in 2015, didn't go through with it. Maybe if the PPP comes to power, they will surprise us. I don't think they'll surprise me. I don't think they're interested. I don't think they're interested. And part of the reason they're not interested is because there is not a critical mass out there of people from both ethnic groups who are calling for it. All right? African Guyanese were very excited about power sharing in 2011. I was on that part. And it got the biggest applause line. And because we made the argument to them. But if you tell them about power sharing, as I am trying to tell them now, they'll ask me if I'm crazy. So it's not just Indians who are asking me if I'm crazy with power sharing. Black people too, right? Because if the PPP saying they're not willing to share, they're saying, if we win the thing, don't share. David Hinds, you're crazy.
Well, Chris, do you think, and again, you're on the ground, you're also a political mind, should the PPP, again, hypothetically, they win the election, the count is declared, what should they do to create a stable society to ensure that everybody in Guyana are represented in a PPP government?
Well, it obviously takes more than one person to ensure stability. It ensures everyone some degree of acceptability. Look, we had, after 1997, the Herdman-Sun Accord. We've got so many recommendations. I don't know when last you guys looked at that document. I keep it, I have it all the time. This is a substantial document. The number of amendments that were made, for example, Article 13 has now been converted into a protected fundamental right. You have the enhanced role of the opposition in the National Assembly. Every single parliamentary committee is headed by a member of the opposition, and not only the head, the deputy is also a member of the opposition. We have all these municipalities. We have the Amerindian communities. You have the provision of continuous constitutional reform. So we have a lot of framework. We have Article 77A that allows for resources of the state collected by the state going to regions. But guess what? Both the PPP and the PNCR make that into crumbs. Now, the Constitution does, I think it was 19, talks about this permanent constitutional committee. It's died almost a natural death. But let me tell you a couple of things that we can do. If David Hinds wants to represent his people or his area, when I say people, I don't mean African Guyanese, I mean his community. Why should he be prevented from doing so? Democracy should allow people to put themselves up and to be voted. Why must political parties have to contest in 6 of the 10 regions? That itself is undemocratic. So there are simple things that we can do. Why must you have 50% of the national parties competing or participating in local government elections? I remember Brother Yussi Guyana saying that, look, take political parties out of this. And I'll tell you one thing that I think could transform, and I'm not going to Ravi Dev's a full federal system. If you take the same Article 77 and you then make an amendment to the Fiscal Enactment Amendment Act and say, you know what? Regions, municipalities, and reservations must be allowed to raise certain types of revenue. And it must get a certain share of the revenue that the state collects out of that region. Take Region 10, all the bauxite, all the timber, all passing through the area. What does the community get? Nothing. So this is why I'm saying I would like to have this kind of constructive discussion, even if I'm called simplistic, no problem. But I think there's so many things we can do. We have to really enact and enforce the Investment Act. We can't have some foreign person coming and destroying a community, setting up and dispensing with the village pharmacy, the village bakery and everything. We need to start thinking, let charity, let development begin at home. I think if we sit around the table, even if we sit perhaps in our offices and discuss through Globespan or Zoom or Skype, the solutions are not too far away. But we have to recognize that there are some easy opportunities. And I really would recommend people go back to this. And it's interesting and instructive to see how persons voted. Ravi, you probably realize in some cases the PPP voted with the PNC and against the WPA. I don't know if you recall.
Yes, of course, yeah.
So, let's start with what we have.
Well, okay, so thank you. I don't mean to cut you off, I'm sorry, but we're coming to the end. And I know, Chris, you said your bedtime is at 9, so I didn't want to go over 9 p.m. So I just want to ask a quick question, then we'll come to closing statements to Mr. Dev. You had written before about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Would such an entity solve any problem in Guyana? Because it seems like nobody's listening.
Well, we put forward that proposal after 1998, the riots of 1998. And we were deliberately very strong in our language. And in fact, Mr. Christopher Ram was one of the first individuals who took exception to what we said. But part of what we said was also to call for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what we felt is that just like how Malaysia, after their 1969 ethnic riots, used the opportunity to say, hey, why are our people rioting? What's the cause of this? And they then worked out a whole new dispensation focusing on economics. In fact, it was called NEP, the New Economic Program. And Malaysia has progressed way beyond what we have in addressing their ethnic problems. So we did call for that, and because part of it is that we felt we need this frank discourse. We need this frank discussion as to what really is happening out there and not to deny that. So I think South Africa showed it can go a far way in addressing the fundamental problems in the society. So I would still like to feel that these are things that needs to be done to encourage the discussion. But as Chris says, we have done so much before. And again, I repeat myself, I might be sounding like a broken record, that we have come, I think, to a fortuitous fork in the road where we now, I believe, can progress to normal politics. And while we might be giving the PPP a chance or the PNC a chance, I think if they act rationally, what we have now found ourselves is that they have to work in areas to, in a sense, placate the other side so they can be, for their own self-interest, to be put back into power. It means that politics will now become centrifugal rather than centripetal. Okay? Thank you.
All right. So I want to come to closing statements. So we'll do this alphabetically. David first, and then Mr. Ram, and then
well, I think
Mr. Dev.
I think Dev is before Hinds, no?
Yes, he is.
Yes. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah. I've been drinking. I have my cup here. I've been taking a little something in the cup, so
Okay.
it's actually more beef. Just
I want to hear what the man say before I go.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, Chris sees before me. Visit me. I'll go. I want to touch again, coming back to this ethnic equity, and like I said, we're speaking a bit frank tonight, David, and I want to address this to yourself. That basically, I have long thought it. I don't think I've expressed it in public often. Is that the African Guyanese experience, African American experience? I think it teaches a lot in how do they address their dilemma, and I think it goes back to the classic debate. Are you there, David? Yes. It goes back to the classic debate between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, where Booker T. Washington said that drop down your buckets. Let us start from where we are and let us focus on economic improvement, where Du Bois said, let's focus on more political agitation. And I think Malcolm X went through the same phase of development. And after 64, he also said, let us focus on economic development. Unfortunately, his life was snuffed out. And I think the Black community in Guyana has this opportunity now to focus on their economic improvement, but a lot of it has to do with the cultural aspects, which can only come from within the community, to look at it itself and what does it take culturally to be able to have the values that capitalism foists on us. Because this thing called capitalism is a world system. You know, Emmanuel talked about that, Wallerstein, but the point is that we have to understand that we have to alter our own behavior to be successful in that. And I close with this, that I lived my formative years in America. I lived in Brooklyn before there was a Richmond Hill. And I lived among West Indians. And I saw my West Indian people, all of us, Indian and African West Indians, progress there because when they went there, they took certain values. And outside of the West Indies, where you think they could have prospered, they prospered in America because they were willing to bring a certain work ethic in a system where they were rewarded. And in every community that Black West Indians went to, they progressed very much more than African West Indians. And there's, I think, a lesson there. Why can't we apply those same lessons in Guyana? Thank you very much.
David.
Which means that they do have entrepreneurial instincts.
Of course.
You know, the whole notion that they don't have entrepreneurial people who bought 200 villages and so on. Yeah. No, thanks to that, Ravi. No, I'm saying thanks, Ravi,
Yes.
for pointing that out. Because often the conversation tends to be too narrow and it's not broad. I think where do we go from here has to do with whether the Guyanese people across the ethnic divide, Amerindians, Africans, East Indians, and other ethnic groups, whether they're given the space and the time to develop that sense of solidarity. Ironically, the long period of PNC rule allowed for that. That's what Rodney did. Rodney came in and he raised questions, and he was able to mobilize African Guyanese and Indian Guyanese mainly. Outside of the electoral framework, his organization was not about elections. It was about developing that sense of Guyanese-ness in order to tackle the development that Chris talked about, developing a Guyana that in which all of us can live and live side by side and together at the same time. But once electoral democracy came back, and I'm taking a hit here at Christopher Ravi, once electoral democracy came back, all that work that Rodney and the WPA did, and that's why the WPA was fooled by it, all that work was then thrown out the window. And I come now to Mr. Dev, right? And the long period of the PPP rule came to an end eventually when sections of the Indian Guyanese community moved away to the AFC and they were able to have electoral change. But I come back to Mr. Dev, that so long as these elections, and let me make it clear, I am not against elections. We have to have elections, but we have to have elections that do not tear us apart. If anybody looked at 1998 and said it didn't tear us apart, they're lying. Or 2001, or 2020. Elections, unfortunately, tear us apart. And we have to find a way to merge elections with that space for Guyanese of all ethnic groups to come together as Guyanese. We have to find a way to merge it. And I'm afraid that we have not reached there yet. 2020 has reopened the tension between quote-unquote democratic elections and ethnic peace. And I don't know where the answer is. How do we merge the two? I think that if we have elections, and that this is an old argument, that is we develop an election architecture in which all ethnic groups win. And so therefore the temperature is toned down and Guyanese people get a chance to examine each other as equal, all the ethnic groups as equal citizens. But 2020 has brought us to this point where there's that sharp tension between quote unquote democracy and democratic election and ethnic peace.
Mr. Ram?
Yes, sir. Well, let me say thank you very much for having me in the program. Clearly, Guyana has unfinished business. The elections and their consequences are upon us. I think it is on each of us a responsibility to ensure that we play our part in whatever way we express ourselves on the results of these elections, that we do not destroy our country in the process. We have to decide, not only across communities, but within communities, how we deal with problems in our country. What role do we have? You know, this program, and I'm always uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable when I have a program and it's 4 men. We really need to start widening.
We're trying.
I know you are. I know we have the same problem here too. Other sections of the community. We must not lose the opportunity, or that has been we blessed with. If we're not careful, we will. We have to talk about what kind of constitutional arrangement we have, who has veto powers, and if the game doesn't go his or their way, how we deal with the situation. There are lots of business still to be done, but I think there's a lot of work that has already been done. If we all can decide, look, we are first and last Guyanese, not Indo-Guyanese and Afro-Guyanese, even though we must not forget those cultural characteristics. I think the future is good, but there are some rocky days ahead, and each of us has to be very responsible in what we say, what we do, what we write, and how we weaponize and glorify any forms of behavior. I thank you very much. And David, I shouldn't forget, 13th of June coming up in another 10 days.
Yeah, and gentlemen, let me just say, I do want to give a shout out to Nicole Cole, who did submit that question that I posted to you guys on the, well, not all of you, but at least somebody addressed it on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I want to end tonight by quoting from an African proverb, which goes like this: until the story of the hunt is told by the lion, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So what I'm saying is everybody has a narrative to say or to present. I know David has a narrative, Mr. Dev has a narrative, Mr. Ram obviously also has his own narrative. It's a little different from what we're hearing here tonight from our two resident guests. But I'm hoping that the conversation continue because it is only through these kind of dialogue that we can build trust and we can build camaraderie and we can move on as a nation and establish basic principles by which all of us can live by. I am ending tonight by saying I still have a lot of fear about what's going to happen, whether it's June 13th or June 16th, but I'm praying and I'm hoping for the best. But I think we need to continue with this conversation. And I do know I want to apologize to Mr. Ram. You're a person I always respect. And I know we've gone beyond your bedtime, so I feel extremely guilty.
That was a joke.
So,
I'm a night
okay.
owl. I'm a night owl.
But I do hope you can help us to enlist some women from Guyana who can be, participants in this all-male show. And hopefully you can join us again in the future. So with that, please stay safe, wear your gloves, keep your mask on, keep your distance, but keep engaging each other. And I appreciate all of you guys joining us. And I always say he has his mask on. So until our next program, I bid all of you good night.